Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. Today, we will chart the presence and passage of so-called tramps, hobos, bums, and migratory workers across Iowa and explore their impact on agriculture, unionism, and law at the turn of the century. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nathan Tye. Nathan is the Assistant Professor of Nebraska and American West History at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, where he has taught since 2019. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and his research focuses on the lives of migrant laborers, better known as hobos, and their efforts to survive on society's margins. Dr. Tye is deeply interested in local and community history, particularly those histories that are marginalized, overlooked, or little known. His research is published in Nebraska History, Annals of Iowa, the Willa Cather Review, and he appeared last summer on NBC's celebrity genealogy program, Who Do You Think You Are? And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Nathan to begin the webinar.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for attending today's talk. We're going to have a very interesting conversation and hopefully presentation on a subject that I'm sure you all have a lot of questions about. So again, thank you. Farm families of the era expected strangers to knock at their door. Although families in the late 19th century preferred peddlers, door-to-door salesmen, and junkmen rather than tramps. Tramps and hobos, who we'll be discussing today, appear frequently in Iowa farm diaries and recollections of the late 19th and early 20th century. During the harvest season, farmers welcomed these strange nomadic fellows, which the West had not yet learned to call tramps, recalled the Iowa novelist Hamlin Garland, who spent part of his youth working on his family farm. Their arrival initiated a transactional relationship between farmers and laborers. Harvest jobs were short, so workers shared very little, maybe a moniker and the broad strokes of their life, if the farmer inquired that far. Farmers' detachment allowed them to rationalize the low pay and ill treatment that they meted out. Transient workers moved between jobs frequently, since the demand for harvest labor was seasonally strong. The interpersonal and spatial distances built around transient laborers reinforced the negative attitudes many communities in Iowa harbored towards transient workers. Now, these nomadic fellows, and this is Hamlin Garland here, looking very, very rugged, actually up in the Yukon. These nomadic fellows hired on their family farm in the 1870s piqued Garland's curiosity, but his memories of their arrival allude to this distance that local farm families established between themselves and seasonal harvesters. For most of the harvest help that year were rough, hardy wanderers from the south, nomads who had followed the line of ripening wheat from Missouri northward and were not the most profitable companions for boys of 15. They reached our neighborhood in July, arriving like a flight of alien, unclean birds, and vanished into the north in September as mysteriously as they appeared. A few of them had been soldiers, others were the errant sons of the poor farmers and rough mechanics of older states, migrating for the adventure of it. One of them gave his name as Harry Lee, others were simply known as Big Ed or Shorty. Some carried valises, others had nothing but small bundles containing a clean shirt and a few socks. Now, these hobos, these alien, unclean birds, worked in Iowa, but the demand for casual labor, particularly agricultural labor, was higher out west. Sioux City and Davenport, and to a lesser degree Des Moines, functioned as hubs where transient workers found work, rested over in Skid Row districts, and caught outbound trains. Iowa's hobo population changed as urban centers expanded, and many moved further west in the 19th century. Hobos were more likely to travel through Iowa than to stay. Yet Iowa's first set of codified laws, the Code of 1851, included a broad vagrancy statute. This statute criminalized fortune tellers, fences, prostitutes, habitual drunks, gamblers, beggars, and of interest to our particular conversation today, those found wandering without visible means of support or employment. Under this statute, the wandering poor needed to guarantee on security that they would only engage in lawful behavior for a full year, mind you, or remain in jail until the payment was made. Should they violate the law during that time, they faced up to 6 months of imprisonment. Yet, as evidenced from the others included in this, the wandering poor were of secondary concern in 1851. It was mostly concerned with forms of illicit economy. But as we'll see later, vagrancy statutes replaced those early laws and specifically targeted transient workers. Now, the number of transients riding the rails increased during the 1870s, brought about by the changes wrought by the Civil War, and suddenly climbed through the end of the century. And this is an image from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper of tramp workers, of hobos, in their various guises and their various activities along the Transcontinental Railroad route, both the Central and Union Pacific Railroad. Here we see hobos in a campsite, hobos underneath a passenger car, and then hobos being beaten and bloodied by conductors and brakemen throwing them from the train. Post-Civil War, railroad expansion facilitated the movement of workers across the nation. Western railroads, railroad construction drew untold numbers of transient men. Part of the irony of this story is many of the men who laid the rails were also hopping freights illegally to and from work. Tramp workers were a central source of seasonal labor throughout the region. Yet as Iowa historian Shelton Stromquist found, violent cycles of railroad expansion and contraction led to alternating labor shortages and a glut from one season to the next. But beyond railroad work, transient workers arrived in Iowa to meet a growing need for harvest labor, or were pushed west into the wheat belt. This is a later map of migratory labor patterns, agricultural labor patterns in the United States. This is from the 1930s, but largely maps the journeys that we're going to be following today, and looking where transient workers, migrant farm workers are going. And as we can see, folks are coming through the Great Plains, going north from northern Texas through Oklahoma, and then in onto the Canadian prairies, harvesting wheat. You see movement through Iowa for sugar beets, but actually not included in this is the large number of men needed for just harvesting corn before farm mechanization. So there's other movements that are not charted on this, but this is largely the journey that we're going to be following today. Now, these folks are in labor-intensive agricultural economies, and so those who are involved are harvesting wheat, as we can see here from northern Iowa, from Laverne, a wheat field in the 1890s, which is an incredibly labor-intensive crop to harvest. Again, you need to harvest the wheat, you need to thresh the wheat, you need to put it into shocks, or seen here, it's drying out. And you need some skill for this, because in the turn of the century, you're also threshing wheat with here we see from Cedar, Iowa, a threshing crew with a steam thresher. And many of those men next to the pile of wheat are some of them are local, some of them might be attached to a threshing crew, but you're also just having men who are passing through, who are, again, the intensive labor process that is involved. You need a lot of men very, very quickly for a very short period of time, and then they need to move on. And so these are the folks who we are going to be discussing today. Now, before we get further into this conversation about hobos, we need to have a kind of discussion about terminology. This is by no means complete, the terminology for transient workers in the late 19th century and early 20th century. There are dozens of variations based on the type of industry that they're in, the age that they're at, where in the country they are at, who necessarily they are talking to. It is variation upon variation. Not all of these are in English. And so it is a wide number of terms for what is largely itinerant casual labor. So very labor intensive. Um, Folks who are working in the timber industry, folks who are working in the construction industry, folks who are working in agriculture. But as we're going to see, largely the story of Iowa is the story of agriculture, and the shorthand that transient workers themselves used, and then sociologists later picked up, and historians like me continue to use, is um, this little phrase: hobos wandered to work, tramps worked to wander, and bums did neither. And so this was the hierarchy, and this is an image from the Hotel de Gink, which was actually run by transient workers themselves, providing food in most major metropolitan cities in the United States. Um, Hobos kind of gave themselves this hierarchy. Again, when you're on the margins of society, any sort of privilege or power that you can have. So a transient worker might say, well, I'm not a tramp, I'm not a bum, I'm a hobo because of these things. Now, they also define themselves in part in the ways where they lived and where they traveled. And so this is riding the rods. This is in the railroad technology of the late 19th, early 20th century. You have these steel rods for support that are running underneath boxcars. And this is where men and women and others are riding. And so you see this gentleman kind of demonstrating the ways. And so again, when a train is going fairly slow or has stopped, you would crawl under. Sometimes you would have a piece of wood that you would carry with you to use as like a little bit of a support, and then you're under the train. But you know, cinders are getting kicked up. It's you're coming out covered in dust and dirt and rain and snow, and it is an awful thing. You also have tons of steel between you, so many a hobo loses an arm, a foot, or their life riding trains this way. You also have, and this is a photograph of, as you can see in the corner, the bow jungle, the hobo jungle, and this is the types of campsites that you would find outside of most rail cities with a rail line, near some place that is secluded, has some close proximity to town where farmers can go down and find people if they need work. It's also close to a rail line, and typically a place where a train is going to be stopping or slowing down. So a water tower, a water tank, a coaling station, something that would allow folks to hop onto trains. Now, Iowans have a very complicated relationship with transient workers, and it varies from disdain to the need for these individuals, and this is initially kind of articulated by a largely forgotten but important Iowa author, Octave Thanet, seen here in a photo from the New York Public Library, and Octave Thanet, who's from Davenport. In one of her earliest published texts, it's The Tramp in 4 Centuries, and it's a collection of fictionalized letters of how you deal with the wandering poor over historical time. And she argues that we need a laissez-faire attitude towards the transient workers. And this is shaped by the experiences she had in 1870s Davenport. Her biographer, George McMichael, noted that in the 1870s, tramps and hobos frequented Davenport because of both its proximity on the rail line as well as presence on the Mississippi River. Over the Mississippi River in Moline and Rock Island, that purportedly fire bells and church bells would be rung to alert local residents when trains with tramps aboard were nearing the Quad Cities. Now, it's uncertain exactly how true that aspect of the story is, but Octave Thanet, nonetheless, and this is her nom de plume, her actual name is Alice French, is writing and basing these observations in her attitudes. And so is seen here: superficial remedies harm rather than help. Indiscriminate almsgiving and artificial employment, for this occasion only, in one direction, and excessive penal legislation in the other, are equal injurious. So she's trying to argue this kind of middle path, where we're not going to give too much support, but we're not going to penalize them too much, and that ultimately tramps will just solve themselves. In her attitude. This publication was so well received in Lippincotts that Andrew Carnegie wrote her a letter praising the essay, giving an indication that those higher up in the U.S. economy at the time thought that also found the tramp a pitied but irascible figure. Now, townspeople across Iowa found the passage of tramps through their community more than just a mere nuisance. They threatened the social order. And the first quote here from July of 1880 is actually from a memoir of Albert Parsons, who's a labor leader and an anarchist leader who's ultimately executed by the state of Illinois. But in his journeys across the Midwest on various speaking tours, he found a bold handmade sign nailed to the wall of the Kansas City, St. Joseph, and Council Bluffs Railroad Depot in Nebraska City Junction, Iowa, right across the river from Nebraska City. And the sign reads here, "Tramps are hereby notified to move on." And he noticed on this speaking tour in 1885 that he witnessed, quote, "tramps on the wayside everywhere," a sign of the mass unemployment that is brought about by the economic decline and depression in the United States, and particularly in the Midwest in the 1870s. You also see other kinds of attitudes where this Oskaloosa Herald from 1893, where they are the community is arming themselves. This is the subtext of this article. That take notice, some of the men who live in this town and own property and live here have unanimously adopted a resolution that such measures have been agreed upon. They're not telling you what those measures are, but the subtext is clear on that will most effectively bring about the desired result. Don't take this as a bluff. You must get away from here and stay away. Otherwise, we will fire. We will fire upon you. We will commit violence. We will kick you out of our community. Now, you see these attitudes, and then you see this next quotation from the Marshalltown paper that the hired man problem is growing to the insistent stage. Next month, farm work will begin in earnest all over Iowa. Whence is the farm help coming? So simultaneously, we don't like you. We don't want you here, but we also really need you. Why aren't the farm workers coming? Why is it because there are signs that say to kick them out? Is it because we are armed to the teeth? And this again shows this maligned but necessary attitude that these communities had for transient workers in the late 19th and early 20th century. And part of the difficulty in many of these Iowa communities in navigating the presence of transient workers was that they lacked sustained relief systems to manage this influx of unhoused and impoverished men. In most communities, there were on small scales what was called outdoor relief or private charity for these men as they were moving through town because they are poorly paid and overworked. And as a result, municipalities and state governments turned to vagrancy and anti-tramp statutes in the late 19th century. They also provided resources in other ways. And this is one of the incredible kind of documents that survives. And this is in the special collections at the Davenport Public Library. And this is a tramp ledger. And so what many municipalities did, and few of these documents actually survive, is that communities would rent out jail cells overnight, that they would have empty jails. And this is also in an era when funding for jails and sheriffs and police resources was severely restricted by many municipalities, and so sheriffs and police captains would look to ways that they can make money. And what this is again, these men, and it's unclear again from the surviving material. You would pay like a nickel or a dime, and you would get to sleep in an empty jail cell overnight. And this was seen by the community as a way to both keep these homeless men, these men who are passing through town, off the streets, from sleeping in city parks or sleeping in the hobo jungles or elsewhere, and also providing some income for the city jail. And so as you can see here, this is September 1910. So this is when you would have large amounts of men passing through the area as part of the harvest season. And folks, they're providing all their names. And there's some indication on some of these where you don't have names. There are individuals who are just identified as Mexican or an individual who's just identified as cripple, where you are also getting a sense of the different types of folks who are coming through the area to work the harvest or work, again, it's Davenport, so many of these men might also be working the river. It's unclear and difficult to kind of tell. But in the late 19th century, the state of Iowa updated its 1851 vagrancy statute, and the new bill that went before the 23rd General Assembly in 1890 was expanded to specifically target hobo workers. The law decreed that any man over 16 found begging or wandering without visible means was legally classified as a tramp. The bill passed with a wide margin, but there was some concern over the severity. Senator James B. Harsh from Creston argued that, quote, "I am unwilling to consent that the asking at any door in Iowa for food by a stranger shall be subject to severe penalties." Under the new law, judges could no longer have, they used to have discretion that they could make these men take employment within the local community. Instead, those legally deemed a tramp were given 10 days of hard labor or 5 days of solitary confinement. And the hard labor was working typically in many of these communities, breaking stone in stone yards that would then be used for the paving of roads, or cutting of timber for fireplaces in municipal buildings. But not every community needed stone broken. Marshalltown had the tramps weed the dandelions on the courthouse lawn. Refusal, though, to take hard labor resulted in an additional 10 days of solitary confinement. Any leisure materials, including cigarettes, playing cards, books, and newspapers, were forbidden. And under this law, bread and water were the only approved meal for tramps in solitary confinement. Now, this is an extreme reaction to the presence of transient workers moving through the state. And this is particularly acute. So this law is passed in the 1890s, early 1890s, and by 1893, the United States sinks into what was then known really as the Great Depression, where you have nationally an estimated 2.4 to 2.7 million Americans out of work, which is approximately 17 to 19% of the population out of work. So you have an untold number of individuals taking to the road, seeking out casual labor, transient labor, just to survive. This unprecedented mass unemployment overwhelmed private charities and forced thousands onto the street. And it ultimately spurred a national march on the Capitol by many who would be considered transient workers, which is where we'll talk about next. Now, fearful of becoming overburdened by the homeless and potential unrest, vagrancy laws were particularly harsh during this period. And they drew on this kind of centuries-old attitude, what Octave Thanet was drawing on in her essay 20 years prior, and was used to, police different types of community standards and things. And with this presence of tramps, it becomes such a grave concern. In Fairfield, the city council discovered feeding tramps was more cost-effective than imprisoning them, though. So some communities are willing to resist the kind of push for more extreme legislation that is happening. They furnished soup at a city hotel for these so-called tramps, as they report in the paper. Denigrated and despondent, they were told, quote, "the same old stories of mines being closed, of factories being shut up, and that these unemployed tramp from town to town." But they find that not only is work unavailable, but, quote, "the working men of these towns are also on the ragged edge of despair." Now, communities some are opening up their doors, others are responding violently. In December 1893, a group of tramps beat two deputy sheriffs in Oskaloosa, and an armed party of locals responded. And this is what prompts the earlier quotation that I shared with you of locals arming themselves in response to the presence of tramps. But this response, this push that is against the unemployed, that is pushed against the poor, results in the first mass march on Washington, D.C. Now, which we are going to be discussing, but to give you a further sense of what the Panic of 1893 looked like, this is a humorous take from Puck magazine, which was a satirical magazine published in the late 19th century. And this is the wealthy of America having to live like everyone else, that you're going to be using old streetcar horses for your polo games, that you're going to be drinking beer out of a bucket at your club, or selling your daughter's dresses. But if you see up in the upper corner, the lack of traffic might oblige the railroads to take off local express trains and carry suburban residents as above. And you can see now everybody is becoming a hobo. And as the United States lurched through this unprecedented depression, hundreds of men marched through Iowa on their way to the nation's capital, many of whom would be deemed tramps or hobos, to join what was known as Jacob Coxey's Commonweal. And these are images from their passage through Council Bluffs in the spring of 1894. Press reports deemed these men bums and tramps, and what Coxey's army was calling for was was calling for employment of unemployed men to work on roads to improve the infrastructure of the United States and use federal funds to employ these men, put them to work in a way that will improve the economy of the United States, the infrastructure of the United States, and take us out of the Depression. And there were other kind of policies that were part of Coxey's Commonweal and a lot of kind of millennialist rhetoric about religion and kind of other populist themes that were drawn through this. And this movement was incredibly threatening to Americans in this time period, but also heavily supported by many of the communities that the movement um, uh, that they passed through. And rumors of the marches purported revolutionary intent that they were going to march on Washington and overthrow the government. So drew sustained interest from law enforcement to the point where there were Secret Service agents embedded within Coxey's army sending reports to the Secretary of Agriculture, J. Sterling Morton, to President Grover Cleveland. So much so that the Iowa's Commissioner of Bureau and Labor Statistics, W.E. Oblesness, he and his clerk donned the clothing of a tramp printer disguises and enlisted in the army as it passed through Adair. Oblesness wanted to, quote, form his own opinion of the invasion and the invaders, end quote. And his willingness to understand the marchers contrasted that to many of the local communities, like Eldon, Iowa, where the deputies met Kelly's army with clubs. Throughout the 19th century, the presence and passage of these hobos, as we're going to be seeing, stirred up a lot of emotions, both support, revision, derision, and others. And in his subsequent report to Governor Franco Jackson, Obless argued that, quote, there is no doubt that a large percentage really started with the intention of going to Washington and believed the good result from this movement. Now, Oblesness found that a majority of the men wanted work if they could find it and could not, contrary to press reports, quote, be classified as tramps and vagrants as those terms are generally understood, end quote. Now, Oblesness admitted that Kelly's army certainly acted like tramps. Again, this photograph of them in Council Bluffs arriving on top of a train that they had also illicitly acquired, as we're going to talk about. Certainly made them look like tramps, but, quote, they traveled with no means of support, subsisted on public charity, and their banding together made their continued presence in any community both a burden and a menace, end quote. Nevertheless, the army was law-abiding and earned the sympathy of locals as they passed through Iowa. Their passage, their visible mobility, revealed the extent both of community support and understanding for transient workers, as well as the animosity that they had. And to give you a sense of the scale of this industrial armies movement that Jacob Coxey kind of unleashed in the spring of 1894, is these are the maps of all the of the major industrial armies that were following Jacob Coxey, who is actually just the very small blue line from Massillon, Ohio, to Washington, D.C. Kelly's army is the blue that actually starts in San Francisco, makes its way over the Sierra Nevadas, across Wyoming, across Nebraska on the Union Pacific, and then into Iowa and Des Moines, where they actually abandon railroads, and as we're going to see, they make boats. But all of these industrial armies largely made up of the unemployed, many of whom are transient workers themselves, beg, borrow, and steal trains, and then travel across the country. Many of them walk, many of them are traveling in mass in hundreds and thousands of people bound for the US Capitol. And this terrified large sections of the United States. And so when Jacob Coxey's Commonweal marched on Washington, D.C., and it captivated the nation. And Jacob Coxey's an interesting figure kind of in U.S. history, and he lives through the 1940s. He has a very, very long life. When they arrived in Washington, D.C., the famed reporter Nellie Bly actually led the army into Washington, D.C., and she called them a deluded band, so ragged, dusty, sunburned, weather-beaten, footsore that they dragged along weakly, 2 by 2, down Washington streets. And she found Coxey's army, quote, a more woebegone and hapless lot of looking men I have never seen and never to see again. Now, newspapers frequently referred to all of these industrial armies as tramp armies, and Coxey and his organizers intentionally presented them as unemployed, skilled workers, men and some women who were unable to work, and that they were not tramps or hobos. Yet, because tramping was kind of an indelible part of working class life for many in the industries that were had such large forms of unemployment, and that many of the marchers had a history of riding the rods, of working harvests, and the fact that they stole trains to travel over the vast distances in which they would. They're they are and they aren't a tramp army. And Nellie Bly actually interviewed a member of Kelly's army that made it all the way to Washington, D.C. And this unemployed carpenter turned farmer from Nebraska, who Bly corners when they're marching into Washington, said that he had traveled on a roof of a boxcar and would return the same way if the march failed. The hobo, in all likelihood, was part of Kelly's army, had joined as it passed through Nebraska, and then went through Iowa, both on board a train and eventually down a boat. Kelly, the Commonweal and Kelly's army across Iowa made visible the conditions that people were reading about in the newspaper or were experiencing in their own communities, but it nationalized the plight of the unemployed, and it moved. It made visible the politics of this era. And this is again the first march on Washington, D.C., which was largely kind of an unprecedented activity. This idea of protesting in Washington, making your voice heard directly to your legislators. And was, as we're going to see, not particularly persuasive for the aims that Coxey's army wanted. But they hoped to go on to Washington. They hoped to get to Congress. They hoped to be met and welcomed by the legislators, that we are the people. Railroad magnate James J. Hill of the Great Northern Railroad called for military action against the, quote, hapless-looking men who were marching on Washington, D.C. in a letter to President Grover Cleveland. And the presence of undercover agents, even the head of the Department of Labor, of Bureau of Labor Statistics in Iowa, meant that there was interest in what was going on. And this is the army as they're leaving Council Bluffs here. Again, hundreds of men, unemployed men, and the gentleman standing atop the wagon is General in quotations Kelly, leader of the army. And this army rode freights and marched and rallied locals to their cause across the West. When they departed San Francisco, they spent 2 weeks crossing deserts, mountains, and open plains, and were exhausted when they showed up in Council Bluffs on April 15th, 1894. And the city and Iowa was very, very angry with the Union Pacific Railroad, because the Union Pacific decided to take the train that was carrying the army that they had largely acquired, borrowed, if you will, and they moved it into Council Bluffs instead of leaving the train in Omaha. So Governor Frank Jackson of Iowa rushed to the city and ordered up 7 state militia units to defend Iowans from this ragtag group of tramps and hobos. And so not only was the Council Bluffs made responsible for housing and feeding all of these men, but they were angered by the curiosity seekers that were then pouring over the river from Omaha to gawk at the spectacle, as the Council Bluffs non-parallel wished. Quote, "We will never again be witness to, in the history of our country, something this amazing," end quote. Crowds from Omaha packed the Army's encampment, and labor organizations hoped to cross the river and hold supportive demonstrations, including the Knights of Labor and other organizations in Omaha. In response, the non-parallel offered a simple message to Omaha, quote, "Stay at home," end quote. After 4 days camped at the city's Chautauqua grounds, and with railroads refusing to carry them east, the army set out on foot. So they couldn't get a train. They weren't going to be able to move, so they just decided we will march to Washington from Council Bluffs. And among the marchers, who is with Kelly's army and documents this trip, is a shoeless 18-year-old hobo from Oakland by the name of Jack London. And in his diary, which survives, and this is seen here, this is his diary documenting, as you can see up at the top, Ottumwa. This is part of their journey across Iowa. He says when they got to Council Bluffs that there were enthusiastic crowds on foot, on horses, and in double rigs turning out in every town to see them. And London would later take this tramp diary, which is at the special collections at the University of Utah State, into his hobo novel, The Road, which is not one of his most popular novels, but directly takes all of these experiences and transfers them. And so the army sets out on foot from Council Bluffs, led again by General Kelly here at left. And then actually, this is another photo of Kelly's army, and it's some believe, and it's been identified, that this gentleman in the corner is 18-year-old Jack London. The likelihood of identifying one person in this mass crowd and it actually being a famous American author, a little suspect. But they're moving, they're walking. And meanwhile, back in Omaha, a mass of Kelly supporters, led by a group of women, swarmed an arriving three-car Union Pacific passenger train. A Knights of Labor organizer, an engineer, then who these women plot with and are able to locate, steams the locomotive and the train across the river into Council Bluffs, and then meets the army as they're marching out through Weston. When the train arrives, Kelly, he's being gifted a stolen train from his supporters in Omaha, declines its use. Also, the three-car train wouldn't have fit the estimated 15 to 1900 marchers that they had, so they just continued marching on. Now, many feared that the violence, should the army remain in the state any longer than necessary, the Non-Parallel warned, quote, that a rising tide of the working men and danger to the railroads and property and possible bloodshed would occur if they stayed another week. Although supporters of the movement demurred the possibility of violence, they nevertheless saw it as an unprecedented challenge to the existing political order. In an account of Kelly's army's travels across Iowa, a Coxey sympathizer and a member of the Knights of Labor Union considered the march on par excuse me, with the establishment of Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth and the dissolution of the British monarchy, that this was a complete and revolutionary transformation of the political order. Now, despite critics' claims, the army pieced passably through Iowa. Here's another image of the army outside Shelby. The only recorded violence across the entire march of Kelly's army, of all of these tramps and hobos and unemployed men across Iowa, were a number of Pinkerton detective agencies who beat marchers in Ottumwa. Once in Des Moines, the army decided to change tact, that the rails weren't going to work anymore, so they built rafts, and they went down the river, down the Des Moines River and the Mississippi rivers to St. Louis. But the sailing was really hard. You're on a crude raft built from scrap lumber, eventually going down the Mississippi River, which is, as we all know, not a small river by any means. And after days in the sun, they finally arrived, and the St. Louis Dispatch, quote, made clear that these men are not tramps, because tramps were constitutionally incapable of withstanding the struggles of a forced march across the country. Yet they readily admitted the stereotypical tramps joined their ranks, quote, attracted by prospects of free food and rides stolen on railroad trains, end quote, only to flee at the first sign of hardship. And Kelly's army does ultimately make it to Washington, D.C. This is an image of the both Coxey coming into town, as well as a photograph of Coxey on the steps of the Capitol, where he actually tries to go into the building so that he can present a petition that his members have been carrying, but he's arrested along with the other organizers for walking on the grass. And the army very fades from memory over the coming years, and doesn't really mobilize kind of the political forces that Coxey had hoped would be engendered by his movement. But as it faded from local memory, others in Iowa demanded better treatments for tramps nonetheless. The Iowa Socialist Party's ticket or platform in 1899 blamed industrial capital, quote, for the millions of willing workers on the verge of starvation, compelled to tramp the roads and streets of this country in looking for work to obtain means to support themselves and families, but look in vain, end quote. Their platform demanded universal suffrage, equal wages for men and women, an end to capital punishment and child labor, and had a multifaceted solution to the so-called tramp problem. To improve the state's roads and rivers, they called for the unemployment to be hired at fair wages across the state, echoing the initial call of Jacob Coxey to hire the unemployed to work in infrastructure projects, which we will eventually see in the CCC and the WPA and other things during the Great Depression. And they called for a full repeal of all, quote, pauper, tramp, and conspiracy laws and other regulations broadly considered to be vagrancy statutes. So they also saw the repeal of these laws targeting the unemployed as a major part of, changing the perception and the response to unemployed transient workers in the state. Now, Kelly's army, the Coxey's army, and then the Socialist Party platform in Iowa illuminate the political and economic tensions and the responses to transient laborers within Iowa. And together, these political platforms and protests forward a reaction on vastly different scales, both national, local, and regional. But, we also see in Iowa a very unique case of a way in which a hobo is pushing against the restrictions on their way of life. Um, and that is in the case of Joseph Johnson, who appeared twice before the Iowa Supreme Court in 1902 and 1905, articulating both kind of the right of hobos to ride illicitly on trains, as well as seeking damages for treatment by railroads. He was, as is articulated, and all the parties in this court case agreed, riding a train out of Dakota City, Nebraska on October 26th, 1898, and he hopped aboard a Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha Railway freight that was bound across the river over into Sioux City. And he was headed east to work the wheat harvest, as all hobos were doing. He'd probably had some work in Nebraska, had heard about the availability of work in Iowa. It's kind of unclear, but he didn't have a ticket, as hobos are wont to do. So he clung to the boxcar ladder on the very short ride into South Sioux City. The brakeman ordered Johnson off, but as the train rolled out of town, he jumped back on the train. Again, the brakeman saw him, ordered him off, and Johnson complied. But then the moment that the brakeman, hopped onto another car or was out of sight, he jumped back on. And as the train picked up speed, and it's an estimated 10 to 15 miles per hour, according to the legal accounts, Johnson held fast to the top of the ladder of the boxcar. The brakeman reappeared and demanded that the hobo either pay him a fee so that he can ride, which is also fairly common, or to get off the train. Johnson's response is unclear. It's not, whatever he said to the brakeman does not enter the legal record. But the brakeman did not take it well, whatever it was, and so he stomped on Johnson's fingers. And as he scurried down the ladder, the brakeman followed him and kicked his head and neck repeatedly. Johnson then falls from the train, falls underneath the train, and his foot was crushed and later amputated. When the train, and at this point in time, the train was in Iowa. Both parties, both the railroad and Johnson, agreed on the basic accounts of this near fatal ride. But rather than debate the particularities of the fight, the central question of this case, which worked its way through the district court and then the Supreme Court, was whether the railroad's ability to, quote, to lawfully protect the trains from the invasion of tramps, end quote. And the railroad's lawyers argued that railroads had the right to protect their right-of-way, rolling stock, and transported goods from trespassers, and that they could use any means necessary to do that. Moreover, this was not solely a matter of commerce, but, quote, the safety and well-being of the whole traveling public, for all are vitally interested in the safety and promptness of carrying service, end quote. And so if railroads couldn't remove trespassers, which also is part of what this case turns on, it would undermine the customer's belief in the integrity of the rail line. If you wouldn't want to ride on a rail line that was infested with tramps, that you wouldn't know who was clinging to the outside of your boxcar, you wouldn't want to ship your goods, your grain, anything on the line. But the Iowa Supreme Court readily admitted that Johnson was, quote, an imprudent and exacerbating trespasser, end quote, in their 1902 opinion. But they found that this did not justify the railroad's attempt to cause bodily harm and or death. In other words, the ability of hobos to ride trains was innately criminal, but not a death sentence. Railroads had every right to remove trespassers from their freight trains and passenger trains, but could not inflict unnecessary violence or deliberately expose hobos to unreasonable harm or injury. The railroad was liable for the hobos' safety and not the negligent brakemen. It was the railroads who were at fault here. The justices made clear that this by no means railroads were tasked with improving the safety of their trains for the benefit of hobos. That didn't mean that they had to add all sorts of safety features, because hobos took their own lives into their hands when they illegally hopped a train. But once aboard the train, their trespass was complete. They had been successful. They had committed an act of trespass, and any action to remove a hobo afterwards was an act of eviction for which bodily harm or death was too severe a punishment. Thus, the Supreme Court ruled in Johnson's favor with damages as well, overturned the district's ruling, and ordered a juried retrial back at the district court. And so in 1904, the case came again before the Iowa Supreme Court, and the railroad sought to overturn the rulings against them. And after the failures of their earlier case, the railroad lawyers refocused their argument more on the proliferation and danger of hobos. And when Johnson was injured, quote, a large number of persons commonly known as tramps or hobos were accustomed to trespass upon the freight trains, so much so that hobos were accustomed to enter upon and leave said trains with the same were moving rapidly and hop off just as quickly when ordered by train crews. In other words, the railroad could not be liable for the injuries of Johnson because hobos were so common and so skilled at hopping off trains that actually Johnson was at fault for being a bad hobo. Upon seeing Johnson's appearance, the brakeman rationally assumed he was, quote, one of the class of persons commonly known as tramps and hobos, and that he could, with safety, get upon and alight from the sides of boxcars, end quote, on trains going much faster than the 10 to 15 miles that they were riding. The justices found these arguments immaterial. They said it doesn't matter whether he's a good hobo or a bad hobo, you still can't try to murder him. And that it wasn't enough of an action, his appearance wasn't enough justification to throw him off the train. And the Supreme Court then affirms again the decision of their earlier decision. And Joseph Johnson's 6-year fight against the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha was not the typical avenue for hobos seeking justice. There's a small amount of case law on this issue that the justices do look at and the attorneys draw upon, and there are a couple subsequent cases, but is very, very rare for a hobo to actually sue the railroad. It makes the case unusual, but not unprecedented. But there are other ways in which hobo workers, as we're going to see, are responding to their treatment in the community. And although it established a railroad's legal liability for injuring and killing hobos, the onus for enforcing this new legal position remained with the hobos themselves, and it is not a group of people who have attorneys on retainer. So rough working conditions, poor pay, and the frequent unemployment, as well as violence being meted out by train crews, largely continued well after this legal case. So with that, hobos had to turn to some other avenue to find support, to find someone willing to articulate their views and defend them, and that was the industrial workers of the world. Now, as a gateway to the wheat belt, Sioux City served as the disembarkation point for hobo workers headed west, as well as a place for hobos to winter over. This role rendered the city an important organizing point for the industrial workers of the world, the largest union for harvest workers. By 1917, the Manchester Democrat found Sioux City to be, quote, a kind of vortex when it comes to the migration of the hordes of industrial workers of the world from the harvest fields in Kansas and Nebraska to those of to those of Minnesota and the Dakotas, end quote. Founded in 1905, the IWW sought to unify all workers under the banner of one big union, and their advocacy for direct action and confrontational tactics, though, drew public condemnation and violent suppression. And this is an image of IWW songbook, for which they are still very well known. Some of kind of the classic labor and protest songs in the American canon come from this text, which hobos would carry with them, and they would sing the songs in the boxcar or when they were having meetings. And then this other image is actually of a specific, the Agricultural Workers Industrial Union, which was part of the IWW. This is one of their labor halls. Yet they were the only union to take up the banner of migratory labor. In 1915, the IWW established the Agricultural Workers Organization, later known as the Agricultural Workers Industrial Union, specifically to organize harvest workers. And we see here actually a red card, a union card from a member. It's a bartender actually, but he's a member of the AWO, the Agricultural Workers Union. So they would have carried this around with him, and in many ways would function as a ticket on the train, both IWW hobos were known to throw non-union hobos off trains, but also unionized rail crews sometimes would recognize this functionally as a ticket for organizing the trains. And we also see here an image from the Industrial Worker, which is one of the magazines of the wide periodicals published by the IWW. And you see the harvest worker, looking for that new day sun, working in a wheat field, and their salvation lies in the industrial workers of the world. And the IWW in Iowa, which warrants significant further study, the Des Moines local was an early proponent of specifically organizing harvest workers within the national IWW. And this proposal ultimately became the Agricultural Workers Organization. The union quickly became the driving force in organizing transient workers across the wheat belt and as well throughout the West. And the AWO became the largest union of hobo workers in the nation. In 1916, its membership was estimated at 18,000 members, and their dues renewed the IWW that had been on the decline for a number of years. And the financial boost that the AWO provided allowed the IWW to expand its national organizing efforts. And in Sioux City, the union support for harvest workers, though, did spark controversy, as we're going to see throughout the teens and the 20s. And then by the 1920s and 30s, there was also kind of an enduring presence of the IWW in the state. But again, the IWW's ideology, methods, and support for hobo workers did not endear them to a lot of Iowans. Although they obtained public support from influential figures like Sioux City Mayor Wallace Short, the IWW were targeted by community groups and as well as scathing editorials. In 1914, Marshalltown's Knights of Columbus chapter hosted David Goldstein, a Catholic convert and member of the Cigar Makers and International Union, who lectured on the evils of socialism and the dangers the IWW posed to, quote, the legitimate unions of labor, end quote. While the IWW's ideology, as described by Goldstein, worried some, the more immediate concern over the presence of IWW harvesters drew wider public attention. Wobblies seized trains, forced towns and cities to feed them, and commit other acts of violence, warned the Manchester Democrat in January 1917, foreshadowing the rhetoric used to suppress the Wobblies during the First World War. The presence and travels of Wobblies across the state, many of whom were also seasonal harvesters on the move, tapped into existing local anxieties about hobo workers. Wobblies were more than mere hobos in the eyes of many Iowans. Rather, these men were radicals committed to the dismantling their way of life. As a result, the IWW organizing drives and demonstrations garnered harsh responses throughout the teens and the 20s, and particularly during the First World War. During the fall of 1914, the IWW expanded its efforts to organize hobos in Sioux City. They held educational nights at the Socials Party Hall. Their Wobblies provided daily hot meals during the winter for unemployed hobos. The IWW made meals from local donations, a sign that some in the community did support their relief efforts to feed the homeless. Unemployment was widespread in Sioux City, but little was being done to alleviate the problem. So the local Wobblies crashed the local commercial club's banquet to demand action, so their Chamber of Commerce. In response, the city used commercial club funding to put men to work grading the streets. To prevent further disruption, the city's banned street speaking, shut down the Socialist Hall's daily meal, and looked the other way as private detectives hired by business leaders drove Wobblies out of town. In response, the IWW called upon members to descend upon the city and agitate for free speech on street corners and in the Socialist Hall. Now, at the height of this free speech fight in Sioux City, 83 Wobblies were charged with vagrancy and disturbing the peace, and they languished in a purpose-built stockade outside the city jail. Mind you, this is the level of suppression that folks are feeling towards these unionized hobos. The local press called for more stringent conspiracy charges against the so-called agitators who continued to cause trouble. Police beat the imprisoned Wobblies after they refused hard labor, and then they went on a hunger strike after police threatened to stop serving food, and then they also set fire to their bedding to protest the jail's inhumane and vermin-ridden conditions. The IWW, though, found vocal support in a local preacher, the Reverend Wallace Short. Short did not condone their methods or ideology, but supported their First Amendment rights. In a sermon critiquing temperance, he commented on the Wobblies' ongoing free speech fight in the city, and Short proclaimed, "These men have done in Sioux City thus far nothing different from what the fathers of our present sons and daughters of the revolution did when they held meetings for the discussion of their grievances." These men have merely criticized the existing order. It is possible that the existing order deserves criticism. Whether it does or not, these men have the right to criticize it if they wish, which was quite the position for a pastor to take in this period. Now, finding themselves confronted by an intransigent foe, the city yielded ultimately to IWW demands, a guarantee for free speech rights in the city, and a release of all 83 imprisoned Wobblies. In return, the IWW would tell its members to stop flooding into the city. Now this episode underscores the amplified fears of Hobo in Iowa, particularly before World War I. But Sioux City authorities ultimately acquiesced to the demands of the Wobblies, in part to stem the arrival of any more hobos in the city. And over the next few years, the IWW operated in Sioux City with little controversy. And Wallace Short would ultimately be part of this. He was ultimately elected mayor of Sioux City and would continue his support for the rights of the IWW through his tenure. Seasonal influxes of harvesters continued through the First World War, but nationalist and nativist rhetoric that would raise its head during the First World War, it began to attack the IWW as an un-American organization. In January 1917, Sioux City State Representative Frank C. Lake worked with legislators in bordering states on anti-IWW laws. Lake wanted to restrict the carrying of concealed weapons on freight trains and penalize those who, quote, conspired to ride on trains by force or violence, end quote. When war was declared in the spring of 1917, state guards units deployed to protect key infrastructure points from German saboteurs would actually round up hobos that they found riding trains. Troops guarding the Missouri River Bridge in Sioux City forced 45 Wobblies off a Chicago and Northwestern train. The Wobblies claimed the Sioux City police chief promised that they would not be bothered, but the railroad welcomed their removal and thanked the state militia for reducing the IWW presence. As the war progressed, Iowa joined 15 other states to pass criminal syndicalism laws targeting the IWW. Iowa's law made the advocacy of violence, crime, or sabotage to achieve industrial or political reform, either in writing or simply spoken, a felony. Thus, wartime anxieties provided the state with further mechanisms to control the movement of transient workers. And wartime attacks on IWWs threatened to end the Reverend Wallace Short's first term as mayor in 1918. Elected in March, Short found himself at the center of a local firestorm after testifying in defense of over 100 members of the industrial workers of the world who were on trial in Chicago. He told a Chicago courtroom that the Wobblies broke no laws in Sioux City during their 1914-1915 free speech fight, did not incite violence, nor make themselves indecent or beyond the norms of good citizenship. His testimony incensed business, religious, and labor leaders in Sioux City and spurred a recall effort. Short made clear his support of the IWW was a defense of their constitutional rights, not their methods or ideology. Short's defense of his actions, coupled with the lack of labor support for the recall effort, appeared to end the controversy, and the recall effort failed. But in April 21st, 1919, Short reignited community tensions by speaking at the convention of the Agricultural Workers Industrial Union held in Sioux City that year. By 1919, local, state, and national laws enforcing suppression had weakened the hobo union, but many still considered it an ongoing threat to the community. Mayor Short spoke to a crowd of less than 54 Wobblies, reporters, and law enforcement. Shortly thereafter, though, the county sheriff, W.H. Jones, raided the IWW hall with the help of 150 deputies. They did not encounter resistance from the few Wobblies present, and hoping to prevent further confrontations, Mayor Short asked them to leave the city. They agreed. Business leaders led another recall effort over this support of the IWW, but the mayor won the vote handily. Throughout the controversies of 1915, 1914, and 1919, Short never wavered in his defense of the IWW's free speech rights, even when wartime nationalism prompted suppression of both the IWW and free speech. In an impromptu speech at City Hall just prior to addressing the IWW in 1919, Short made these convictions clear. Quote, "Our soldiers have been fighting for democracy, and it is incumbent on us to see democracy in action," end quote. Sioux City's battles with the IWW were the high point of hobo politics in the state. Less than 6 months after the convention in the city, the Palmer raids, led by the Attorney General, began and weakened the IWW further. Now, by the 1920s, social scientists and hobos themselves observed a drop in the number of transient workers. Advances in farm mechanization lessened the need for harvesters. In the 1880s, E.H.H. Holman recalled hearing the harvesters hired by his father in Sergeant's Bluff, Iowa, decrying the coming days when the machine would, quote, take men's jobs away, end quote, during the corn harvest. That day arrived some 40 years later. While railroads remained the dominant mode of travel for hobos, automobiles cut in the 1920s, and these are depictions of kind of the shift in mobility. That in the 1920s there was reporting that hobos were now transient workers were now able to buy automobiles. They didn't ride the trains as much, and farm mechanization was putting many of them out of work. Farmers realized in the 1920s, according to historian Dorothy Schweider, that farm life was good, but it was not good enough. Decline did not mean the total disappearance of hobos, but fewer made their way by boxcars. Farmers and townfolks understood the role of transient workers within the market for seasonal labor, but across Iowa feared their presence. Thus, hobos workers' presence in the state reveals the complex contours of law, charity, community boundaries, violence, and the law in late 19th century and early 20th century Iowa. And with that, I'm now open to questions. Thank you all for listening to my talk.
Well, thank you, Nathan. We have some time to answer about 2 questions. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat here, but let's jump in right now. A question was submitted asking, were there many African-American transients along with the white tramps you spoke about?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there was, and this is the difficult nature of researching transient workers is they're notoriously poor record keepers. There's not a lot of material produced by transient workers in and of themselves compared to things that are written about them. And there are, it is not uncommon to find African American workers among transient workers, particularly in the Midwest, and particularly beginning in the 1920s when you have more folks coming through the Great Migration. Many of them are actually hopping trains and coming through. Within the kind of body of historical material for Iowa, most documentation for transient workers, African American transient workers, is actually kind of in Davenport, where folks are able to kind of come up the river or have passage out of Chicago. But unfortunately, it is underrepresented within the historical record, but there are some notable African American hobos. William Attaway, who was from Illinois, and it later became Harry Belafonte's manager and co-songwriter, hoboed during the Depression, as well as Ralph Ellison, the famous author, wrote letters. He hopped trains to Tuskegee as a young man and wrote letters back to his mother saying, well, I wasn't on top of the boxcar, so it was fine, I was inside. So there is some documentation as well, but unfortunately it's not as existent or easy to track down.
Thank you. This will be our last question today. An attendee pointed out that Britt, Iowa still hosts a national hobo convention. What more can you tell us about Britt's connection to hobos?
Well, so there's a couple things, and I knew that we're talking about Iowa, so I knew this would come up. So in the late 19th century, hobos and tramps were really kind of dominant comic figure within popular culture. And so this is a dime novel, a postcard, and then 2 tramp joke books. And this is kind of the cultural milieu with when Brit emerges. And Brit actually got its origins in Illinois. The very first one, they say it's the third, but it's actually the first, which is part of the joke. It was a group, it was led by a newspaperman in Illinois, from Seymour, Illinois, who, again, in the late 19th century, it's kind of a high point for fraternal organizations, the Elks, the Masons, the Oddfellows and things. And so he created the Tourist Union, number 63, that was modeled on all of these fraternal organizations, and supposedly set up lodges across Illinois. And they had a convention in Davenport, or in Danville, Illinois. And this gathering, they did a lot of advertising. They said it was going to be a hobo convention. It was going to be this whole thing. And then actual hobos showed up. And the community was not particularly happy with that aspect of it. And so, and this is in 1899, so the following year, and this is from the Omaha World Herald, in July, they say that, well, we're not going to do it in Danville anymore, but the people of Britt, Iowa have decided to take this. And so they did hold, in 1900, they did hold this convention that was this mixture of, people playing the hobo, kind of this cartoonish comic figures, as well as actual people who were riding the rails kind of showed up to this event, again, because it was wildly covered in the press. This is from the Omaha Bee newspaper, which sent a photographer to actually document this event. And then it happened. It was a flash in the pan. And then in 1933, the event happened again. The town kind of resurrected this thing that they were known for and have been holding it ever since. So it's the only kind of national commemoration of the hobo, kind of with the mixture of, you know, like a community event, a community festival, and then kind of has its roots in this comic kind of hobo figures of the late 19th century, but has kind of morphed into something else in that time. And that's, in short, kind of the trajectory of Brit.
Well, thank you. And with that answer, we will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone joining us today. And we'd like to extend one last thank you to presenter Nathan. And we hope everyone will join us for future Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. Now, for more information and to register for future webinars in this series, please check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can check out some of our other fantastic digital programs we have. We have our Goldie's Kids Club activities, Fearing Historians, and other past presentations. We look forward to virtually seeing you here again for the next Iowa History 101 webinar on January 26th. Thank you all for joining us today and have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.